This is a little bit different than we covered last on there because we were talking about recruiting, retaining talent, bringing people into the workplace on there. This goes more into a leadership aspect of there, essentially a proponent of how do you actually take someone who's, say, an individual contributor, maybe they are lower performing, and bringing them to a level where they can act, think on their own 2 feet. And you can think of it sort of like a part 2 to the winning the talent war talk, because this is where after you have that employee, what do you have to do to get them to a point where they're being an active participant, driving the team forward, and then also being a strong leader in there? Like, what are those steps in that process? So also what was mentioned in my previous presentation on there is that these slides, which let's see. Nope, this is not working on here, so we're not going to worry about that. The slides are available at jeffjbutler.com/slides, in case you want those on there, just a reminder of the previous side. All right, leadership. Many of you have been to a leadership talk. Fairly confident, probably the vast majority of you. And every single person has their own definition of leadership, right? That's for helping people or adding a positive impact in the world. And I'm not as for like the Steve Jobs, Elon Musk type leadership. I think each one of us can take control of our own lives and make smaller decisions that you're leading yourself in the actions that you're having. Because I think it's sort of like a very Western idea that you're going to be the central star of your team and you're going to lead everyone forward. It's like, look, not everyone's really cut out for that. But there's parts of leadership where we can engage in our lives and start to cultivate and move towards what we want in there. And because of that, I'm going to do probably something you've never seen anyone do at a conference before, is that I'm going to literally set a social experiment in here to help everyone here define what is actually leadership. And so what I'll do is I'm going to create a problem. And I want to see in the room who actually understands leadership and willing to solve the problem. So I'm going to start the problem, and I'm going to see what you guys do. Ready? And begin. Give them a round of applause just for getting up there. All right. A little easier. Okay, that was easy for you guys, right? Okay. I did that for 350 people in the audience in Tennessee last week. No one got up for a minute. The event planner, I told them ahead of time, I'm like, look, this is what I'm going to do. So if no one goes up, I'll give you a signal, and you go up, and then everyone's like, oh, she's a leader, you know. And she kept staring at me like, when are you going to go up there and fix the problem of the conference? I am paying you right now to sit down and not talk to people. I'm like, hey. But here's the thing. I believe that that action you just took right there is leadership. Every day of our lives, there's some sort of situation that's like that, where we're walking down the street, someone needs help, or maybe you see something that's wrong, and you're able to act on it. The thing is that I define it as having a vision, being able to see your surroundings, and being able to act on it. I think that's a much more realistic goal for leadership for everyone of where they are, because there's so many times in our lives where we see something, we know what's right, we don't do it. That happens a lot too on teams where, let's say there's lots of changing times where we're like, hey, this whole video thing, our technology is really beating us up, and maybe management will figure it out. Maybe someone else will figure it out, right? It's always someone else. And you ran up stage super quick. I was like, okay, this is gonna take either, I was guessing 15 seconds, but it was like 5 seconds, probably because you already talked to me. You're like, oh, I can do just about whatever I want in here, so I'll just run up and do it. But it's also a smaller room, right? A little bit more intimate on there. But I really believe that that's the figure. And so if you can get employees doing that, I think that's pretty profound, right? That they can go up, see the problem, they'll act on it. Having leadership in their whole lives is paramount. Now, what you often have is poor leadership. Forbes puts it as, people don't leave jobs, they leave managers, right? And here's also another case for that. A lot of your jobs you have aren't the most sexiest. You know that. It's like, oh, cameras, oh, right. I have jobs in my company are really, really boring. It's just a thing of it. But guess what? People stay and they're happy. Not because of the job, of what they're doing very often, but because of the people who are there. And that's something that was pretty big to me because I come from a world of Silicon Valley where it's like you have to be in the fastest charging startup, changing the entire world, revolutionizing it, or maybe you can work at a place where you really just respect the people. And I think that's a very strong hold because not everyone has that luxury of having the coolest job in the world. What we all can say is who actually works there and the kind of culture and team that you provide. That can be changed on there and can be in any industry that you want on that side. So you ultimately find, though, as if people are able to step up more into that leadership role, there's a couple of effects. One is the recruitment side. People actually would be more engaged with the leader, like maybe they see a nice little video in the recruitment video, whatever you have, right? And they're like, wow, I really can get behind this leader, right? This is someone who I really believe in. And they start telling their friends and whatnot, like I mentioned, I think before, is I have in my company, I have a husband and a wife who worked there. The wife worked there for a long time, who was a referral, and the husband joined. And then I had one person who invited their sister to join, and also a cousin, right? Because it started attracting more of the people who are in like cause in there, which is fantastic to me. It doesn't cost me any money to recruit, but at the same time, that has to be built through solid leadership. And next is retention. Like one of the most, as someone who has a company on there, one of the most powerful things I ever heard from an employee is them saying, I want to be here for, as long, like for years, 10 years, 20 years, I want to be here for a long time. I'm like, wow, like in the time of today where things are changing all the time, like that hit me harder than, oh, I love this job, I scored all this cash, but this was like, wow, like, that's a powerful effect. Next is organization optimization, right? When we talk about different generations in there, one of the most powerful effects that you can get from people of different backgrounds is that they'll solve problems differently. And someone's going to solve the problem in the most effective way. And when you have, say, an organization with effective leaders, they know how to build an environment where they can extract the knowledge from people in sort of like a hive mind and solve some problem. Because today's day and age, people talk a lot about diversity and inclusion. They're all about it, like, oh, this is fantastic, we need this and this and this. But that doesn't matter at all unless you can get people communicating. If you can't get people communicating, so what? Okay, great, you look cool, right? Because you have a diverse staff, but you're not actually leveraging the power of those differences, right? There's no point. That has to exist on there. And last but not least is productivity. You have people who are more engaged, they're showing up, they're putting in work. If it's past 5, I like the place I'm working at, I'll keep working. So they all have very powerful effects on there. Now, if we look at leadership from a higher level view, I like to think of it like driving a car. That in leadership, people have different roles in a car. You have your people who are in the back, your passengers, right? They talk, they're there for the ride, they know where you're going, they don't really care that much, they just talk and go about their day-to-day business. Then you have your drivers. They're actually driving the car to that location on there. And last but not least, you have your navigators. Someone who has Google Maps, because of course you can't be looking down at your phone, that's illegal, right, while you're driving. You have someone who navigates for you. Which one of these roles is the most important role in getting to the right location? Yes, navigator. Because have you ever been with someone who cannot work Google Maps? Yes. No matter how good you are at driving, you'll end up at the wrong location. And this happens also in the workforce. You can have the fastest working employees, but if you're going in the wrong location, you're not going to get there. In fact, one of the things that they often ask larger corporations is this company being productive? And that's a very hard question because what if an entire team is being really productive, but build an entire project that the customers don't want? Is that productive or unproductive on there? So you need navigators. And what happens is that there's a gradual progression where people start as passengers. They then become drivers, so they're individual contributors. They are moving the company forward, but eventually they become navigators. They're able to see problems and act on them, right? They see a problem, they can move, etc. That's how I like to see as an easy progression that people have when moving forward in the workplace on there. And that's the framework we'll be using for this presentation. Now, when we look at this from sort of a generational lens or just sort of people differences, there's a large hurdle for generations, especially when we look at technology divide, because that was the most questions I had about video ever in a presentation. It was like, video question, video question, video question, video question. I'm like, okay, well, videos are important on there, right? But there's a gap, right, of how do we actually get that gap working together effectively on there. And it's one thing to talk about it, but it's another thing to live it when it comes down to generations. In fact, I was thrown into this environment of generations. Yes, someone asked me to, but I was talking about it for a while, but then I was recently asked to do something that I never would have considered. So it turns out that my grandfather, who's on the left-hand side right here, so basically the water, so my dad's to the left of me, so I'm on the far right, my mom's right here, which she's also right there, by the way, say hi, Mom, all right? This is the first talk she's ever seen of me, by the way. She's like, can I finally see a talk of yours? He's been doing this for years. Sure, Mom. So then my grandfather, my dad, and me, right? So the water each year gets a little better, we grow a little taller. That's the theory. So grandfather promises my grandmother that he would buy her a house in Cohasset, Massachusetts when they were in their 20s. He's 80 now. Finally bought it. For insurance reasons, they needed a full-time person living there because he has a house in California. He's like a real estate guy. He has some place in Las Vegas, California, right? That's like how he made his wealth. So he calls me up and he's like, hey, do you want to live with me? Now, I don't really know him. I probably talked to him maybe 10 hours in the past 10 years. So I don't know if many of you watched the movie The Shining at all with Jack Nicholson, but I thought if I would go out there, he would go maybe crazy, chase me around the house with a knife or an axe or something. Like, I don't know what was going to happen. So I qualified the situation a little bit. I said, hey, do I have to, do chores? You just put me to work all day. He's like, there'll be a few things, but I have help, so it'll be fine. And then asked, well, you're going to have a caretaker there? Turns out he has 30% of his heart left. He's had lung cancer and skin cancer, right? It's a miracle he's alive. And he said, I have someone who'll be there. You don't have to take care of that stuff. You don't have to change my bed or anything like that. I'm like, okay. And then I went for the jugular, and I said, do I have to pay rent? He said, no. I'm like, all right, I'm in. So I fly from California to Massachusetts in a week of knowing this. Moving with them, don't really know the guy, right? I come from Silicon Valley. He grew up in Massachusetts in poverty and had a really tough upbringing. So there's things wrong with the house. It's a big house, and there's a lot of things wrong with it. As you know, when you buy a house, first off, there's so many things that are wrong with it they never even told you. So I'm having to fix things that I never fixed before in a house. And he's asking me for certain tools and stuff, and I'm having to learn a lot. And he asked me, hey, can you get me a stud finder? Now, some of you might know what a stud finder is. If you don't, it's a little cool tool that can find wood in walls without actually seeing the wood. I was like, wow, that's amazing, right? It's like, doesn't work for bones, but it works for wood and walls. And I was really surprised he asked me that for a stud finder, because I thought a stud finder was an app to find studly men. And I was at the verge of this huge breakthrough of the entire family history starting to crumble, because if I have to break this to my grandmother of his new app that he wants me to find for him and download onto his phone, I'm like, I don't know, I don't want to be breaking that on there. So fortunately that was not the case, and we start fixing things. And there was a furnace, second floor, that he's basically playing backseat quarterback. He watches me, he tells me what to do because his hands aren't as strong, plus he's on blood thinners, cuts his hand, right, bleeds a lot. So he's like, okay, Jeff, handle this. I'm replacing a part in there. Finally, I fix it, and I think in my head when I sit back, awesome progress, okay? He doesn't hear me. And he stands up next to me and says out loud, awesome progress. Same exact thought in that setting, 2 generations apart, World War II, right? Millennial kid. Somehow we were able to see eye to eye on there and come together in that invite, regardless of our differences, because we both had goals. I'm like, hey, it's a pretty good deal, live here without rent, but on his side, it's, hey, it's a great way to meet. Now that I look back in retrospect, it was probably a really good way to meet his grandson. And it was pretty remarkable to see I had more in common with him than my own father, which I'm like, whoa, I never even knew you on there. So pretty revolutionary experience on that side. So we look more further out in terms of generational demands. There are quite a few on there. One of the things that they have is in terms of diversity and inclusion. I talked about that a little bit on there in terms of it doesn't really matter unless you're able to communicate in the workplace effectively with people. If you can't do that, like what's the point of going through all of that on there, right? So that's one of the requests. Next, the work-life balance. That has been accelerated through COVID hardcore. I think a lot more of the world right now is more willing to be accepting of things like remote work, flexibility on there, but a lot of employees and employers still have to be careful about that because not everyone's made for that environment. That's a totally different discussion. Next is career development, right? How much someone grows in their role, right? I want to grow, fair enough, I think we all do. And last but not least is purpose. I want to highlight this because I feel like a lot of places, especially with yours, it's like you might say, well, we're not the most sexy. And here's the thing. I think if someone's looking at a job and trying to find purpose in it, it's probably the most, this is going to sound really hard, but I really mean it. I think it's one of the most narcissistic things you can do. Because purpose is one of the hardest things to find in your life, right? It's so hard, and it only can come from you. It's like hard to find in love because it's like your reason for existential existence, right? And this is like a journey you go through in life, and we always watch movies thinking, how did the hero find purpose in their lives? And then someone's going to turn around and say, my employer has to find that for me? No matter what the employer does, the individual has to find it on there. And that's why I see a lot of like articles that go out there and talking about purpose. We need to find purpose in our work, and it's like, look, there are so many jobs out there that people work to feed and protect and make sure their family's safe. That's a pretty damn good purpose. Even though that job might not be the coolest job in the world, it has a purpose in their role in their life. And so if you feel that, oh, I need to find this amazing purpose in the work, it's like, no. It's more of it's the individual's job to find that purpose in what they do day to day on there. All right, outside of radicalism, we got another quiz. I think you guys know the drill, right? The 1, 2, 3, perfect. Okay, so employers don't leave jobs, they leave blank. 1, 2, 3. Perfect, all right, we forgot the 1, 2, 3 part, perfect. Drivers are the most important role in driving a group to the destination. 1, 2, 3. Yes, it is the navigators that are on there. So the first phase of this is the passenger. This is when someone's probably brand new, just started a role, or maybe they've been there a while, but they're not a solid contributor. They might take a lot of managerial experience, a lot of basically working on them one-on-one. They just really are struggling at that point. They lack knowledge on the how, the whats, the whens of the job, and it takes a lot of energy to get them up to speed. Now, whenever you have a working environment, expectations is super important. Is that an Apple Watch?
It is.
And it talks to you?
No,
Oh my goodness. I was like, wow, I want an Apple Watch that talks to me. Okay, so every human relationship has implicit and explicit expectations. It turns out, like that interaction right there was an explicit expectation, right, that our watches don't talk to ourselves, right? That's like an expectation. Our watches should not in those cases. But in that case, right, I identified it, I addressed it on there, right? And every relationship we have hundreds of implicit and explicit expectations on there. Think of a romantic relationship, right? Hey, we're together, we're in a relationship, that means no cheating, no this, no that. What if you have an open relationship? Well, then the terms change a little bit, right? And there's also more subtle ones where it's, let's say someone has an expectation of when you should do the dishes, when you should not do the dishes, right? Hundreds. And employers mention this. You show up at this time, you leave at this time, et cetera, et cetera. So the point is that if you become more explicit in those expectations and look at it through that lens, you can work with any generation, but also, regardless of the level of expertise, you can basically be able to people to grow to a point of a driver. Now, if expectations are not met across the board, there can be decreased output, push more authority, right? Become resistant on there, because in our minds, we hold this thing called Adam's equity theory. We try and make sure that every environment is balanced and fair on there. For instance, if I was shoveling snow for 10 hours, got paid $10, my friend comes along, they shovel snow for the same time, get paid $50, 5 times what I'm being paid, how am I gonna react? Right? I'll decrease my output, right? So it matches, I'll push more authority, tell my boss, I'll become complacent, disengaged, or resistant. Those are all effects that take place. So when you work with different people, expectations in management and getting people to a leadership level are pivotal to that success. So you might be thinking that maybe your expectations don't apply to you, right? This is outside of your environment. Well, turns out researchers looked at this and wanted to know if this exists in nature. So they took some monkeys and put them side by side. They wanted to see if Adam's equity theory kicks in with monkeys. So for those of you who don't watch Joe Rogan and don't know much about monkeys like grapes way more than cucumbers. So they fed one group of monkeys grapes and the other cucumbers. And here's what they found. So Adam's equity theory, yes or no? Wholeheartedly. And that blew my mind. Like, wow, like Adam's equity theory actually exists in nature too. Like, I wouldn't expect that on there. So the thing is that when you have expectations, they're the great equalizer, right? They drive the culture, but they also set some sort of expectation for the rest of your team to get them up to the driver level on there. Now, when you have expectations, usually there's things called SOPs, right? Standard operating procedures on there, where you have to define what's required. But think of this more as you're setting a target for their performance. That here's the pathway to become a driver in your organization. Because you can't hit a target that you can't see. And when you can make it very specific and you make those expectations clear, right? The implicit going to explicit on there, it becomes way easier for people to figure out the how, the what, and the when. To make things more like transparent, let's say you have a calling team on here, right? This is a format some employers would use is like, hey, if I have someone who's doing sales for me, you have to do this many calls and emails. It's an explicit black and white side, so people know if I'm succeeding or if I'm under the bar on there. Very often, employers aren't very specific on this because they're worried about losing the employee, so they don't set the bar, and they complain that the employee's not doing well, but they haven't set those hard expectations. So it starts to be involved. This is regardless of whatever role you're in. As you set the expectations, in the beginning they won't meet them, right? They have to get used to the level of activity, the process, the procedures on there, and the coaching involvement's super high. But if they keep progressing on there, the coaching involvement goes way down because they're able to meet more and more of those expectations over time on there. But there's a very important process. If you're going to develop leaders that you, in this stage, you need to pay attention to. And that is the aspect of deriving and extracting their interest and their ideas. What I mean by that is very often employees will work at a place for a while and they'll have like 20 ideas on how to improve the organization. Very often people would say, well, you can't do this because of X, Y, and Z reason. Fair enough. But that was intrinsic motivation. They're internally making that decision that they want to contribute something to the organization on there. And if you shut that down, that basically bleeds out that idea of like, okay, I might not be able to make an impact here, or my ideas aren't valid here. And I'm not saying that you take in every single idea, because there's often a lot of ideas that come around that you should not implement. But it's that drive that you need to be paying attention to, because that's the drive that can help them become a navigator, because they're thinking on their own here. They're not waiting for you to say what's right or wrong, but they're like, hey, I'm thinking, I want to make things happen on there. And that's one of the pathways to getting them to the navigator role. Now, very often, people might not be able to meet the expectations of your environment. And that is not a bad thing on there. The bad thing is if you don't set the bar. Now, how do you handle if someone's not able to meet the bar? Well, set the deadline. Deadlines are key, right? Hey, here's my activity level. If you can't meet this within 2 weeks, we're gonna have to look at performance correction actions. If that doesn't happen, 2 months, you're out. That scares some people. They're like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna get fired. It's like, well, I'm not just handing out money. It's not a charity. Like, yes, there's service that you have to produce. There's a bar here, right? And if you adhere to quantifiable boundaries, so they can see black or white, they will know that if they are on the right track or not on the right track. And here's the powerful point. If you make that clear in those expectations, They will fire themselves before you fire them. Because they know, it's like, okay, I made a mistake, I didn't do this, and I'm not longer in the company. The same thing exists in relationships of all different types. Let's say someone cheated on someone else. They're thinking, yeah, they're probably gonna break up with me, right? They break up before, right? And it works in that sense on there. And the whole heart here, though, is keeping integrity. That if you set those guidelines, you better stick to it, because if you don't follow that, they're gonna keep pushing that, and you're gonna basically lose that credibility expectation side. You have to keep integrity with those expectations you set. All right, quiz time. Expectations drive culture. 1, 2, 3. Most definitely true on there. I'll explain an exercise too, and you can try it later, because I've done this with police officers, with people who run parks, to C-suite executives, and it's a very powerful thing to do in terms of understanding expectations. If you take a piece of paper and you draw something, really simple thing, right? And then you take the other side and you write down the instructions of how to draw it, and you give it to someone. It could be your kid, it could be your spouse, significant other, whatever. See if they can draw it right. And what you'll find out is they won't be able to. I've had people screw up happy faces, like a smiley face, like 3 dots in a line. Because people in their mind have a certain expectation, and that exercise, what it does is it puts the expectation into physical form. It's the most clear, transparent way of showing what your mind is and what you had in mind and someone else did. And if you're a manager and leader, expectations are the name of the game. And if you get those off and someone's doing the wrong thing, that's because there's a slight breakdown in those expectations. So I would highly recommend you try that exercise. And it's also really funny when you do it with a room, because people definitely screw it up. They know they screwed it up on there, and they can just laugh at it. But I've also had one time a Marine, right? A Marine who was in the group who was like, some people try to be jerks to speakers, and he's like being all like a jerk with me, like tough guy, tough guy. So I'm like, all right, I remember tough guy over here, right? You're a Marine, tough guy. So he comes around, and he's struggling to draw someone else's house that looks like a freaking Candyland cookie on there, and I'm like, tough guy, huh? And he's so upset on there, and it's just. But the point is, it's we all get to be kids. It's a very simple exercise, very powerful in showing how expectations are formed. So if you set those expectations, coach them along the way, they'll become a driver. They're now contributing to the team, they're a part of the team, and they're moving. Most people are at this level because they still work at the company on there. And they usually have a strong grasp of the job, being supervision, and they might be able to have some sort of ideas on how to improve things. But that's the key thing, ideas. Because this is the segue from an individual contributor to someone who can act, who sees a problem and can act on it. Because very often people see problems when they first start, but they get beaten up so much that they say, oh, forget it, it's someone else's problem. Someone else can turn off the laptop on the stage, right? So when those ideas come, just remember that if you give some leadway of okay, if you think we should do it this way, here's an opportunity to do it. What happens is that the manager gives slightly more authority, and it does sort of a miracle thing with the employee. The engagement increases. Why? Because you captured that intrinsic motivation that they had inside, and it's being applied to something that they actually want to do on there. And from there, what happens is the morale increases and productivity. Why? Lotus of control. If you feel you're in control of your environment, that tends to correlate with how happy you are. So when you're able to help them implement something, that's sort of the key result of helping them become that navigator. And that's the big thing we talked about of the new ideas. This is sort of the pipeline of innovation. That is how new ideas come about in companies, is those simple conversations where people are able to cultivate that idea and start experimenting and trying them. That's why a lot of companies now are having internal incubators and tech companies within tech companies, is because they see that. And they're like, how can we harness this information internally? That's why. Now let's say you see someone who has some signs of navigator potential, but you kind of want to warm them up to being a leader, right? Help them being a little bit more of a guide, a linchpin in the workplace. First thing you can do is a buddy and partner. New employee comes, hey, Sal, you look like a potential navigator in the future. Why don't you start working with that employee? Maybe becoming a designated resource. You're managing a team, and instead of saying, hey, I have all the answers, you tell the team, go ahead and talk to Sal. She can take care of everything for you. Prepping new materials for teammates, or maybe even sign as a sort of a nonchalant team lead for certain things. Those are all little tiny stepping stones to get them more prepared for that navigator role on there. Now here's the big thing, though. This goes against a lot of things in the leadership talks. They're like, everyone can be a leader. It's like, look, people can be a leader in their own lives, fair enough, but not everyone wants a leadership position. What happens a lot in the world of technical fields, like engineering, technology, a very good engineer does not make a good manager. And that happens so many times. They see the smartest guy in the room, they say, he should lead the team. It's like, no, he should keep doing what he's doing because he's good at it on there, right? It's a completely different skill to manage and lead versus being an individual contributor. In fact, I made this own mistake where I had an employee say, I don't want to be a leader. I told them they should be a leader. They try to be a leader, and they still hate it on there, so then they step down on there. But the point is that, not everyone wants to strive for that because that's extra responsibility on there. That puts your neck on the line on there. So when you're looking for employees on here to help, say, inspire that navigator potential, usually you can ask, hey, what are your goals in this particular role? If their goals extend past it, like I want to do this big thing, it might be as simple as I want to help this organization grow this amount, or like something small, but it's beyond their current role. That means their goals are stretching beyond where they are. They have vision outside of their current role on there. Maybe you express curiosity. They're asking about different departments. They're curious. They're asking random people, what do you do? How do you do this, right? They're inquisitive about their surroundings. Or they become a team resource, right? People start going to them for ideas, right? Because they have a lot of that information they're cultivating on there. A lot of those are sort of the navigating principles that start to show up over time on there. So what you start to have then is if your driver is able to see the new ideas, the problems, right, and think about it creatively, and then potentially act on there, that's when you start getting to that navigator level on there. Because keep in mind, too, when I set this whole thing up, I was nice to you guys. I didn't just walk off the stage and turn on my laptop. I set the stage. I was like, okay, I'm going to set up a problem. Let's see how you guys solve it, right? I made it a little easier on that side. So it takes a little bit of, that massaging work to make it work. So eventually, though, they'll be excellent performing. They require low supervision, but I like this the most, the bottom one. You could sit down with them and say, what do you think in this situation? I love that question with people. It's like, what do you think? And you can go back and forth and debate them on certain things. Very, very powerful tool on that side. And because if you start to understand these concepts on there, there's usually age differences in leadership. How many of you know someone who's managing someone older? Well, if you think of it from an expectation standpoint, it's very easy to handle on there. First off, it's just addressing the elephant in the room. Hey, I'm younger than you, I'm less experienced, I get that. I want to make sure that I'm harnessing your knowledge, your experience to make sure this team's more effective. Could I use you as sort of a leading expert on X, Y, and Z? Oh, I'm so flattered. They actually acknowledged it. Yes, if you're younger, you got to acknowledge that in the case. In fact, for the early part of my career, 5 years, I was the youngest person on my team. And I was the manager, I was the leader on there. So that would often come up. So I would sit down with my team and treat them more as the experts. But of course, I have to set the expectations on that side. So turn the tables and create those expectations. Now, as you develop these leaders, what's going to happen are the what questions. This will happen. You would basically give them authority, or they'll start acting on their own, but then they're going to stop what they're doing, and they're going to knock on your door and say, hey, what do I do in this situation? And 90% of managers say, here's what you do, and that's the wrong thing. Why? If you're trying to develop a navigator, you want them to think of the solution, right? You don't want to be the sole resource. You want them to think outside of it. So what you say is, well, what do you think is the right thing to do? What do you intend to do in the situation? If I wasn't here, what would you do? And they'll say, first off, they'll be shocked. Because sometimes people just don't think, and they're like, oh, I thought you had all the answers. It's like, no, well, you want someone to think of that. So they'll be shocked, but you'll have to lead them out. Like, no, what would you do here if you had this, this, and this? Well, I might do this with the customer. Okay, anything else? I'll do that. Okay, the first one sounds like a great idea. Why don't you just do that? Oh, well, okay, let me go do that, right? It's like you already had the idea inside, right? And that's sort of extracting that navigational potential out of them, because very often people like to go for other people for answers. Part of that's responsibility, but another that's just the fear of, what if I get on stage and I shut off the laptop and that's not what he intended, right? That fear of making a mistake on there. But if you really want to build that in people, be very careful of those what questions, because that can really get you if you try to be that, great leader who can answer things for everyone, because it's not going to last in the long run. So the benefits of having this are actually pretty cool, right? Retention, as I mentioned, will skyrocket. The team performance actually becomes way consistent because you set the expectations. It's a bar, it's a pumping machine now. People act at that certain level on there. But best is, and this freaked me out, you get way more time. Why? Because you're not troubleshooting everything for everyone, because you have people who think independently, who you've groomed and are able to act on the problems at hand. They're able to think, and then maybe you act as more like a third party on there. And that scares a lot of leaders, because they're like, well, I thought I was the person who was supposed to know that. Well, if you're going to train leaders, part of that is you have to shift back and train other leaders if you really want to have that independently thinking organization that could step up and solve problems. All right, we got one last quiz here. When building navigators, watch out for why questions. 1, 2, 3. Trick question, true and false. If an employee comes up to you and says, why do we do it this way? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Right, because they're thinking differently. They might have another idea that you can groom and help them work with it on there. And you know what? Those are some of the best areas, because very often when people start at an organization, they have all these different ideas of how to change it, and those are like the cultivating ones. Of course, you guys know this one. What is it? Don't cry, it's the end. Okay, perfect. I gotta reiterate, because I gotta teach you guys about leadership, but also emojis, because if you guys don't know emojis, right? That's like more prevalent in your lives these days, so that's what I'm being paid for. She's like, wrote in the contract, talk about emojis. I'm like, okay, I will. All right, so we have, essentially when we start with passengers, there's the drivers, and then the navigators. I kind of like this example because it's much easier to visualize on there for the leadership journey, because it's not like have integrity and be powerful and communicate well, but this is like, everyday life that we go through. Very relatable on that side, and if you have the right expectations, you can get someone to a driver level, but then you have to have them be able to have comfort in those newer ideas. And that's where you start getting that navigator potential. I like to leave you off with a small anecdote here about the app WhatsApp. Any of you hear about WhatsApp recently that shut down Facebook the other day, right? That had that complete outage on there? Okay. So if you didn't know this already, WhatsApp got bought by who? Facebook. Does anyone know for how much? A lot, besides a lot. Like, any idea? 5 billion, right? 5 billion, any takers? 19. Okay, this is the best kicker. You ready? They had less than 100 employees. Whoa. You can imagine if you had equity in that company, how much you would get on there. It's unbelievable how much money they made on there. Now, here's the crazy thing. Where did the founders of WhatsApp apply to before they built WhatsApp? Facebook. Facebook turned me down. It was a great opportunity to connect with some fantastic people looking to life's next adventure. That's the founder of WhatsApp that was later acquired for $19 billion. Some of you may sit there and be like, oh, maybe, I struggle with recruitment or I struggle with managing a different generation. I'm like, look, Facebook's considered a very smart company. That could be considered a $19 billion mistake, because what if he started working there and he started building it, and they're like, oh, this is a good idea, we should add this to our, our product line? Could have saved $19 billion, right? Some of the smartest people in the world there. But that's the power with knowledge sharing on there, right? And if you miss out on those opportunities, well, you'll be like Facebook. And that is 21st century leadership, culturing leadership in the new decade. With that said, we have a couple minutes in here that if you have any particular questions in terms of an actual situation you're facing on day-to-day, I'm all ears in terms of how you can implement those kinds of things on there. So, yes, gentleman in the front.
Yeah, just a quick question on when you set expectations for employee, your business is changing, evolving, so the aptitude becomes the issue, not necessarily engagement or cultural fit. How do you manage to really balance those two things? Where they provide cultural engagement, they provide a resource for the team, but they're
So if I understand you correctly, let's say they're meeting on a metric standpoint, but maybe their attitude's diminishing because so many things are changing. Is that?
No, the opposite. Let's say they're a great cultural fit, but what you need from them, they can no longer provide. Through training, engagement, they don't have the capacity to perform at the level you need to perform at.
Got it. So I'm also saying this because it's being recorded, so I have to repeat it on this side. So I guess then if I can summarize it correctly, let's say someone is a great cultural fit, and now they are not able to perform from a metric standpoint of the right output or productivity for their current role. How do you deal with that situation? Correct? Okay. So let's play it two different ways. Let's say you have an individual who's in that situation, and you say, you know what, they're a great culture fit, and they can continue doing maybe 60%, 70% of what everyone else is doing. From what we learned today, what do you think will kick in the company? Adam's equity theory. Because someone else would say, hey, I'm going at 100%, they're going at 70, why am I going at 100% if that's allowed? Because as a manager, what you tolerate is, the lowest level what you tolerate is what the people will do on a team on there. So Adam's equity will come in. So the question then you have to face is it okay to drop that 70% knowing that your entire team can? Is that yes or no on there? Is that worth keeping that person in line for that, or would you rather let them go to keep up that extra productivity hit?
Would you imagine that you might take a retention hit if your employees see that a dip in performance, regardless of loyalty, cultural fit, engagement, enthusiasm, results in termination?
In terms of your questions, because I'll repeat it again on there, would I be worried about like a turnover issue if they're like, oh my God, this person went, they're a great fit, and then they were fired because of X, Y, and Z reason? Would I fear that other people would start leaving too? That's a major fear for people, but this is where I think as a leader, setting clear expectations on the team is really important on there. Because the cool thing is, if you set those clear expectations, let's say that comes up, you have to let them go. You would say, hey, as a team, here's the bar. Everyone in this meeting meets that bar. Unfortunately, they weren't able to meet the bar. I really like them as a person. But if we're going to survive or do X, Y, and Z, we need to keep meeting that bar. And if you make that clear, there's not a huge of like, oh, how dare he do that? It's like, oh, I'm doing that too. And that makes sense on that side. And I remember I've fired quite a few people on there. I'm not like, going around like crazy maniac on there, but I've had that same fear on that side. Like if I would cut someone, would the people start to leave? But I tried to be as straightforward as possible. Like, that bar? We set that, they weren't able to meet it, and that's it. We have a certain bar on the team, and we respect that bar. And that's the tough thing too, because if you really like the person, I have one employee who seemed like very, very capable, like very skilled, but just did not want to put in the same level of activity as other people. And I had to chuck them because other people started saying, hey, they can get away with being underperforming. I can do that too. And then all the team started to come down. I'm like, okay, no, it's not worth it on that side. And you got to make those tough calls on there. But I think the transparency and setting expectations can really help people understand why you made that decision on there.
And then I guess the last question is, if you took that and converted it, and you said that the person meets expectations but is not a cultural fit, how do you reconcile that against the Adams equivalency theory that, yes, I'm doing or meeting, I'm meeting expectations, exceeding, but I drive everyone nuts?
Yeah. Well, so the question at hand was, what if you had someone who met expectations, but maybe culturally they're just killing everyone, right? They're that bad apple in the bunch. Well, same thing can apply. There's certain expectations you have in the relationships with people in the company that are required, right? But you might not explicitly write them down, but you have in your mind, like, don't tell someone they look really ugly that day when they come in really ugly, or make fun of them for like some pimple on their face, right? You have certain expectations. And when people step over that line and cause a lot more havoc on there, that's something to reprimand and say, hey, if that continues, X, Y, and Z can happen. There's the cultural expectations too in there in terms of how you actually relate to people, right? Even if they might say metrically meet things on there. And that's why like a lot of the things out there with culture in the workplace I don't agree with, because everyone's like, you need to have this totally inclusive workplace that everyone feels safe, and it's like, every culture has its own ins and outs, right? Some people are fit for that culture, other people are not. A culture is a collection of beliefs and values. If you don't fit in that group, then you can go elsewhere on there. Like in the US culture, we are tend to be confrontational with managers. We can speak openly to managers, and actually they provide a lot more open communication versus, say, in an Asian workforce, which I have managed and worked with people in there, that it's not as common to do that on that side. So you can be fired for something in there that would be okay in the US, right? So my point is there are those expectations. And I think you have to get clear on what you actually think of the culture and team and values you have, and set that as an expectation. And if they keep crossing that, then the same protocol takes place. Does that help in terms of your?
Yeah, no, thank you.
I hope your team gets better, because it sounds like you have quite a few things you're struggling with.
Now, some of those are scenarios from past employees, but, as I look back across the number of people that have worked for us in different roles, I sit there and imagine if that employee was valuable after we retained them, or would we have lost this employee if we had removed this person sooner because there was disparity in expectation?
Well, I think too what could help you is that if you don't see as can I retain someone as much as how can I actually maximize the time and experience of which they're here. Because at some point they're gonna leave. Everyone's gonna leave, even you in there. And it's more of, I find it a little easier to look at is if how can I actually make this the most effective experience they've had being here. And sometimes thinking, oh, if they will leave or that will leave and try and play that politics is a lot more difficult. And by the way, I've had people leave because of other employees. Like I had someone literally say, I am leaving because of that person. And I had to make that call. Like, do I fire that person and go by this person? Or do I do the reverse? And guess what? In the past, I've done both. I fired that person, but I also kept in that case. So I think that frame of mind will be helpful on there. Because you always try to maximize the time in people who are in companies, but you cannot control that because they can leave for a multitude of reasons beyond just the employee interaction, and they could just blame the employee interaction for that reason, when it was really they got $20,000 more on their base salary. Appreciate the questions though. It's like little thought experiments. Any other questions in terms of management, leadership, managerial things on there? Yes, in the back. My boss. Sure.
Do you have any experience handling the different leadership approaches amongst your other peers? Even leaders just, this leader, you yourself, the leader, operate this way, and then another team leader would operate completely different way because it's a generational change. And it causes conflict amongst the company regarding, being married, things like that. But any suggestions for that to try and, right the ship in a certain direction? Leadership team.
Yeah, I would be very careful though to state that the difference in leadership is solely generational, because I've dealt with people who are my age from different cultures, and it's really interesting to see like how someone from Latin America and then Asia, like in the same situation, approach the same problem. But I more state that as, let's just say it's in general with anyone who's as a manager or leader, how do you handle, the question is, how do you handle different managers and leaders who lead differently in the same working place? Okay, a lot of the same rules apply on there of what your expectation is of them. And as a leader though, they have a lot more area to bring up a team, but also sabotage the team on there. Because if you have a bad leader, and I've had this, people will start leaving. They might not even tell you because they're like, well, you brought them in there, so I can't be honest with you because you backed them up on there. And that's a scary thing to take place on that side. So how would you actually handle those differences on there? It goes down to what do you actually want in your company on there, if you're saying a director role, and then what key things do you look for in a leader? For instance, one of the things that I look for in a leader that, say, other people might not as much is I would want, say, a leader to cut for, be more prone towards retention versus results. So they might be more like, hey, I want to build a stronger relationship with them, and then they'll fight with me to keep their employee, their team member. And I've had that because I wanted more of that employee. In the beginning, I went for more of a results-oriented, I'm going to chop heads. Turns out the person who chopped heads was like practically psychopathic, so they just started going crazy. It was a huge mess on there, right? But you have to kiss a few frogs to get somewhere. So I had to figure that out of what I valued in leaders on there. And there's a place for that. Like the cutthroat side, I've also handled like an insurance outbound team where they were calling for workers' compensation insurance, a very difficult job on there. And I wanted more of a leader who's going to be cutthroat, who's like, okay, you weren't here for 3 days, you're cut. I don't care if your family had COVID, you're cut, right? There's a place for that, right? But it depends on your environment. It also depends on what you value as a director and leader, right? And I would work off of those two things. Does that help in terms of the Adams equity dilemma that you were bringing up?
Yeah, it does. And it's also you can be a leader, but then you also have a leader that you have to deal with.
Right.
And there can be some conflict.
As in,
your philosophy with that leader or
is it that you are their direct report, or is it that they're horizontal to you?
both. It could be both situations.
Well, you can only, so the thing is, you can only control your current environment on there. Like if I disagree with you on something, I can say I don't agree with you on there, but are you going to change? No, but I can state my case on there, but that's the extent of it on there. They have to make the willingness to change on that side on there. And I often find that people don't often want to say that they are wrong. Like just telling them straight out on there. So I think you being the example of the leader that you want to be will say more than the words that you actually say. Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. Yes, and we'll probably say last one.
So you talked a little bit more about how to handle underperformers, and kind of wanted to add a question on top of that. Another dynamic. Let's say a new salesperson, new to the company, new to the industry, underperformer. Does that change the way you approach that as far as setting expectations, et cetera, et cetera, we talked about earlier?
Right. So if I understand your question correctly, let's say you have a new hire who's in sales, they're new to the industry. How do you take into account that they still have to produce? And since they're new to the industry, their ramp up time, right? And they're underperforming. I deal with that all the time. Because I hire salespeople and I work with them on there. Same thing applies. You have the education materials to learn the industry, correct? Right? And you have quantifiable milestones of where they should be at certain times. Okay, they need to adhere by that. If they don't understand the industry, guess what? It's going to be harder for them than someone who's been in the industry, right? I think we could both agree on that. Same with them. I said yes wholeheartedly on there. So they probably have to do a little bit more legwork of Googling around, understanding the terminologies, the integrator, et cetera, in order to make that work, right? But they still have to adhere by that same rule, because what's going to happen is you get a veteran who's there, and they see a new person, and they're like, hey, I was new to the industry too. What the hell are they doing not slacking off? Right? And then you have that sort of Adams equity theory kicks in there, and then they're going to slack off with your, bringing that down. And I think it's more powerful too as you as a leader, because you can say, look, I know you're new to this, but I know you can do this, and I'm going to set this bar for you. Because one of the most condescending things you can do for someone is like saying, I'm going to set a really low bar for you because I expect very little out of you, right? So I think you got to keep that.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, sure thing. All right, that's it for my session. Appreciate it.